On part 1 of this lesson, we learned about the different features that make communication effective. However, it is important to note that there is no such thing as perfect communication. More often than not, there are certain factors that limit, disrupt, or hinder the communication process. These factors are what we call barriers. There are many barriers to communication, and these may occur at any stage in the communication process. These may also lead to distorted messages and may cause confusion and misunderstanding. Now let's talk about those barriers to communication. What are these things, factors, elements that hinder, disrupt the communication process? There are actually several categories to the barriers of communication. There are certain barriers to communication that we can categorize as physical barriers. Okay, first one, for example, is a faulty organization structure. So take, for example, when you are working in an office or working in an organization or an institution, then if your organizational map is faulty already, then it's gonna be difficult to communicate within and among the members of the system. All right, so that could result to miscommunication, misunderstanding within the organization, within the institution itself. Aside from that, of course, we have noise, the physical noise that we hear, loud music, loud talking, all right? If there's construction going on outside your room, for example, and you're talking to someone, or you're just basically in a physically noisy environment, meaning your ears are affected in some way of processing and receiving the information, then that could be referred to as noise or physical noise. Time and distance are also categorized under physical barriers. For example, if you are on a different time zone, then communication might be, or the dynamics of communication might be different, okay? Distance as well will affect it, because if you're far from someone, even if it's just a short distance, take for example a few meters, and you're already far, it's very difficult to communicate with that person. You already have to shout or scream or say it out loud, whatever it is you are trying to say, which of course would be harmful to us as speakers and of course unbeneficial for the listeners as well. Another physical barrier may be having too much information. This is very particular to students or people who are trying to study, absorb a lot of information in a limited amount of time or in a short amount of time. So it results more often than not to information overload. There is way too many information that is being absorbed, being learned, or being taken into account for, which makes it even more difficult for you to understand them. Because there's way too many, you're having difficulties processing it in your mind. Even in the physical sense, if you have way too many papers in front of you, it's very difficult to go through them. So that could be information overload. Another category in classifying barriers to communication are semantic barriers. When we say semantic barriers, these are simply barriers that pertain to difficulties in using a language, because there are certain features, there are certain elements in the language itself that makes it hard for us to even relay the information in the manner that we want to relay it to. In the English language, for example, we have what we call homophones, homographs, homonyms, of course, the concepts of connotations and denotations. Okay, so we will go at it one at a time. When you encounter similar sounding words, words that sound the same, okay, we call them homophones. So simply put, if you are going to be more specific about it, if it has the same pronunciation, it sounds the same when you say it or when you hear it, okay, it has the same pronunciation. However, the spelling is different and the meaning is different as well. We refer to it as homophones. Some specific examples include pale and pale, alter and alter, rain and rain, and buy and buy. Again, homophones are words that share the same pronunciation, okay, same sound, but different in meaning and different in spelling. On the other hand, there are also words that have multiple pronunciation. Okay, and these are words that we refer to as homographs. To be specific, homographs are words that have the same spelling, meaning they contain the same letters. Alright, however, the pronunciation and the meaning of those words are actually different from one another. So take for example this one. We must polish the Polish furniture. Okay, so the first word polish simply refers to us wiping it down, making it clean, making it presentable, alright? Whereas the second word, which is capitalized, Polish, simply refers to furniture or describes furniture that came from Poland, okay? The country Poland. So this one is a great example of homographs. Another example is this one. The bandage was wound around the wound, okay? Wound is the past tense of wind or trying to put it around, okay? Whereas wound refers to what we get when we get into an accident, okay? Another example is he could lead if he would get the lead out. Aside from the first two, there are also words that have multiple meanings. If a while ago they have different sounds, okay, but same spelling but different sounds, all right, this time we have words that have the same spelling, same sound, however, multiple meanings. So depending on the context of the sentence, they could have different meanings. And these words are what we refer to as homonins. Again, they have the same pronunciation, they sound the same, they share the same spelling, they are containing the same letters, but the meaning of these words would vary depending on the context of the sentence where you used it. So take for example this one. Close the window before the bee gets too close. So the first close refers to shutting it, okay, shutting the window, whereas the second close, the next word close, is referring to distance, okay, minimizing the distance between you and the bee. Alright, so there. Another good example is this. The dog barks at the trees bark. So you would notice that they are the same. They sound the same. They are composed of the same letters. But the first word bark refers to the sound that the dog makes, whereas the second word bark refers to a part of the tree. In using language as well, we have these two concepts, and these two concepts are unavoidable because sometimes these two concepts are culture bound. It's attached to our culture, it's attached to how language is used in the society. These two concepts are what we refer to as denotation and connotation, okay? So when we say denotation, let's try to differentiate the two. When we say denotation, this is the literal meaning of a word. Meaning, when you look this word up in the dictionary, the meaning that you can find in the dictionary, that is your denotation, okay? So how do you describe it? How do you define the word itself? All right, so that is your denotation, your dictionary meaning, okay? However, there's this concept that is what we refer to as connotation. Connotations are emotions and certain associations that we connect to a particular word, okay? So more often than not, this is because we attach certain feelings, certain emotions, or certain experiences to a certain word that we gladly accept that it is the meaning because of those experiences, those emotions, okay? So those associations, those attached meanings to particular words could be referred to as connotations, okay? So take for example the word cheap, okay? If you're going to look up the word cheap in the dictionary, you would notice that its denotation or its literal meaning, okay, is something that is inexpensive. So when you describe something as cheap, it is inexpensive. It doesn't cost too much, all right? However, there are certain connotations attached to the word cheap, alright? So take for example, when you tell someone, oh, you look cheap, that doesn't mean that that person doesn't cost much, alright? We are not talking about the price of that person. We are referring to how he or she must be behaving or how he or she must come off as, okay? If it's cheap, meaning it's low quality, the connotation that is usually attached to the word cheap is that it is of low quality, it's not something that is good to look at, alright? So it's not something that is reliable. It doesn't necessarily have to be inexpensive for it to be called cheap. Connotations such as that one could also be a form of barrier, because sometimes people would take the word point blank. They would take it based on its literal meaning, alright? But they are not aware that certain connotations are attached to the particular word already. So another good example of this one is the word salvage. In the Philippines, when we say salvage, there is a negative connotation to it. However, if you are really going to look up salvage in the dictionary, even if you do it right now and you look up salvage, the word is actually positive in meaning. The word is positive in its literal definition or its definition. Okay? It means to save. However, in the Philippines, when we say salvage or when we hear the word salvage, there is a negative connotation to it because more often than not, it was used to refer to people who were killed. The negative connotation stayed all throughout the years. Other forms of language barriers, aside from those technical aspects to language use, okay, there are also other form of language barriers. So take for example, different languages could already result to ineffective communication. Okay, so take for example, if I'm a Filipino and I don't really understand English that much, remember that you are not always communicating using your first language or your native language. So differences in language, the languages that we use, could also result to ineffective communication. There are certain words that you can say, therefore, the meaning also changes or the other party could not understand it anymore. Another language barrier is there's no clarity in speech. So when we say there's no clarity in speech, it's not clear. The way that you are projecting the words out of your mouth, the way that you are saying it may not be as easily understandable or audible for your listeners. So you have to make sure that when you talk, it's clear, okay? It's not as if you are eating your words. So there's an expression for that. Do not eat your words, okay? Say them out loud. Say them in a manner that you know would be effective and would be easily understandable and audible for your listeners. Another language barrier could be when someone is using jargons, all right? So jargons are words that are very specific in a particular group of people. So this particular group of people are using these words, and when it's used outside that group, other people might not understand it. When we use jargons, we have to be careful. Are we talking to people who would be able to understand it? When there is too much use of jargons in a conversation, especially if it's just a normal, regular conversation, and you came from two different groups of people, then that could already be a barrier. Misunderstanding will definitely ensue. Remember that when you are also not being specific, meaning you are not really pointing out what it is that you want to say, what it is that you want to deliver, then that could be a form of language barrier as well. You are, what do you call this? In English, they refer to it as dilly-dallying. So you are beating around the bush. You are not going straight to the point. You are not being very clear and being concise about your message. Another category in understanding barriers is social psychological barriers. And this is very important because these are barriers that sometimes or more often than not, we do not see. So we really do not know how we could get past these barriers, okay? Because sometimes it happens within a person, okay? Or it happens in the mind of a person. Inattention is included as a social psychological barrier. Inattention is simply not paying attention to a speaker. Okay, they could be distracted in some way, so that's why they're not paying attention. Another thing is having a closed mind. When your mind is boxed in a certain belief or certain ideal, then understanding other people, especially their points of view, might be difficult for you. Another specific example of social psychological barriers are your fields of experience. Remember that people hail from different backgrounds. We came from different families, different religions, different experiences. So our fields of experiences also vary, all right? So what you have experienced or what you may have experienced may not have been experienced by someone already. Group identification could also affect communication or could hinder or disrupt the communication process, especially, for example, if you identify in a certain group, because that particular group, when you identify to a certain group of people, you know already that there's a culture in that group, and that culture might also be different from the culture of other groups. So that in itself could hinder communicating with other people. Aside from those things, the way that you view yourself, your self-image, could also hinder, disrupt, or affect the communication process. It's how confident you see yourself. Do you see yourself worthy of certain opportunities, and so on and so forth. So you have to be very careful with how you see yourself when you communicate as well, or how you consider yourself when you communicate. There's also this problem with distrust. When we say distrust, it's simply not having trust with the source of the information or whoever it is that you are talking with. You are doubtful of who they are, what are their intentions, okay, and so on and so forth. So that could cause a problem as well when you talk to someone. There is also this problem with having poor retention, especially right now at this time and age where everything is easily accessible for people. Okay, our attention spans have shortened. So you have to consider that one as well in terms of communicating or effectively communicating. Attitudes and opinions, or differences in attitudes and opinions, can also affect the way that we communicate. Even your own attitude and your own opinion could affect the way that you communicate. Of course, your emotions are part of social psychological barriers. There are also instances wherein we can't help but filter and distort certain parts or the messages that we send. When we filter and when we distort messages, we are trying to manipulate the content of the message that we are sending. So sometimes that might result to miscommunication as well. Differences in status, in terms of status in the society, could also affect the way that we communicate. It could hinder, it could disrupt the way that we communicate. So take for example, there are certain people who believe that they are above other people. So of course, they will not talk to people who they believe are below them. All right? So for example, if you are someone who is rich and you believe that the rich doesn't have to go down the level of the poor, so you would only talk to people who are rich. Okay, you will not be going around talking to other people who you consider are poor. It is also important to note that there are certain features or aspects of our culture that may hinder, disrupt the communication process. So we refer to these things as cross-cultural barriers. An example of this is language, since language is one of the main aspects of culture, okay? So different cultures may have different languages. So it could be considered, differences in languages could be considered as barriers. The values that we have, for example, the values that we have as Filipinos, they might be different from the ones that Americans have, or the ones that Japanese people have or Koreans have. Our social relations could also affect the way that we communicate. How do we relate? How do we communicate with other people? How do we foster that relationship with them? How we value these connections between and among people in our society. So there are differences in that as well that may be considered as barriers to communication. Aside from that, our concepts of time also differ differ from one culture to another. A very good example of this is the concept of Filipino time, alright? So, if you compare it to the concept of time of the Japanese people believe that if you are late, then that means on the clock, you are actually on time. So, for example, if your meeting is at 8 o'clock, and you come in at 8 o'clock, on the dot 8 o'clock, that means that you are late. If you come in 10 minutes before 8 o'clock, that means that you are on time, okay? However, in the Filipino concept of time, okay, or what we normally refer to as Filipino time, when you come late, that's normal, that's very typical, and it's acceptable in our culture. Not a lot of people will bat an eyelash on that one. Alright, so it's primarily acceptable. But for other cultures such as the Japanese culture and even the Korean culture and Chinese culture at that, or East Asian culture in general, they're very particular with how you value time. Okay, but in Philippines, we are not very particular with that one. We do respect other people's time. However, the concept of Filipino time has been generally acceptable. So it's been known all over the world that if a Filipino comes late, then it's just natural. It's typical Filipino quality. There's also this concept of space that we have to consider. Other people will be comfortable, or other cultures are comfortable expressing themselves in close contact with another example, even if it's a stranger. Alright, so it's okay for them to be communicating it at a close range. However, there are other cultures who are very particular with their concept of personal space, so you have to respect that when you communicate with them. There are instances wherein miscommunication ensues because our concepts of space differ from one another. Of course, there are also differences in gestures, or how we understand, how we view gestures. Okay, so gestures might differ from one culture to another. Alright, so there are certain things that you can do with your hand. For example, the peace sign, or the okay sign, or this sign, the thumbs up sign, that might be interpreted differently among different cultures. So you have to be careful with that as well, or else it could be a barrier to communication. Effective communication involves overcoming these aforementioned barriers. There are many ways in which you can do this, and it is essential that we deal and cope up with these barriers to ensure smooth and successful communication. Here are my sources and references for this lesson. Thank you for joining me.